the one that's so contentious these days. The problem with cumulative effects, of which coal exploration and development is a part, is that they lead to some dramatic changes. In the Crow's Nest watershed, cumulative effects over the span of about 70 years led to the extirpation of a bull trout population that existed in the Upper Crow's Nest watershed above Lunbrick Falls. This population existed since the Pleistocene and was extirpated with the additive things that we did in the watershed to the point where they could no longer find a place to spawn and they died out. It's sad in a way that we don't recognize this. We should actually put memorials up to these species that have been extirpated so that we provide a message to ourselves to maybe not let this happen again. Now, to put cumulative effects in another way, and I'll show you the extent to which I've been working to help you people understand cumulative effects, is it's the reality of the shrinking pie. So if you start over at 1850 or thereabouts, we have a full pie's worth of natural resources. And as we started moving into the landscape, changing the landscape, using up natural resources, the pie got smaller and it gets progressively smaller. The irony is that each one of us comes into the world thinking that there's a full pie's worth of resources available at our disposal. The reality is it's a thinner and thinner slice. And this is the story of how species become extirpated, some extinct, how we change landscapes, how water quality and quantity changes, and so forth. And so it's something to keep in mind in terms of the cumulative impacts of things happening. And just to give you a visual indication, the problem is this thing called shifting benchmarks. We always think that today is the start of everything. We don't think about what happened in the past. And of course, all the things that happened in the past add up and they give us landscapes that are full of our human footprint. And that causes a number of issues in terms of ecological stability, resilience, and health. One of them is roads. Oops, sorry. One of them is roads. And road density has become a surrogate for helping us understand what the possible implications might be on fish and wildlife, as an example. So you can see the progression from 0.25 kilometers per kilometer squared. It's a measure of density. And once it gets above about 0.5 or 0.6 kilometers per kilometer squared, things really start to come apart in terms of ecosystem integrity. As an example, this is a graph that shows what the impacts are on native trout. Once road density measured about 0.6 kilometers per kilometer squared gets to that threshold, that's when fish populations, native fish populations, start to decline precipitously. It also is the point at which grizzly populations start to drop off, as well as elk and caribou and so many others. So there is a direct line between density and what the health of a landscape is. Now, the other thing is there have been to date about 20 cumulative effects assessments done in the eastern slopes. They all tell the same story, that these overlapping land uses, the additive feature of these land uses leads to substantial risk to species, whether they're native trout or grizzlies or elk or caribou. And so we have the information. The information has been collected, and the problem is we don't seem to use the information. Science can tell us what's happening. It can tell us where we're going to go if the trend continues, but unfortunately, science can't tell us what to do about it in terms of listening. Just to give you a bit of a primer, particularly for the eastern slopes, these are the species. that inhabit the waters at the eastern slopes, primarily the streams. All of them are imperiled in some way, either from mountain whitefish, where we just don't know what the population status is, to species like grayling, which are special concern, through west slope cutthroat trout, which are threatened, to bull trout, which are threatened as well, and Athabasca rainbow trout, the only native rainbow trout in Alberta, which is endangered. So what is it about coal mine development? Well, I think the first thing that should jump out at you is the sheer amount of material that a coal mine takes off the top of a mountain and dumps into the valley. And that has some real repercussions in terms of not only sediment produced, but things like selenium and other elements that are released into the water. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail. But coal mine development starts with coal exploration. And based on the rules of the game, as are interpreted by the Alberta Energy Regulator, no impact assessment is required. And so that already sets up a problem because the footprint starts to expand with the first road that a coal company builds. There's no cumulative effects measurement, and so we don't know what the additive quality of those roads are. And most problematic is there is no referral to content experts. And by content experts, I mean people like fish and wildlife biologists in environment and protected areas or forestry and parks. The people that actually work in the area, that have the best handle on populations, that can provide the best information on what the possible impacts might be. Other problems with coal exploration is that there's very, very little regulatory oversight. In fact, next to none. And so, despite what is planned and what is told to the AER, there's no way of checking whether or not the coal company is doing what they said they would do. So, no monitoring or oversight. And the other problem is, and this is particularly prevalent with coal exploration that's happened in southwestern Alberta, is that the amount of coal roads that have been built exceed the linear density thresholds, that 0.6 kilometers per kilometer squared that I talked about. In fact, in some areas, in Grassy Mountain as an example, the linear density now is somewhere around 4 kilometers per kilometer squared of road. So a troublesome number. Now, added to that is, and because there's no inspections and no regulatory oversight, there's often very ineffective erosion control. There doesn't seem to be a timeline that the AER puts on when these roads should be put back to bed, that when they should be reclaimed. So again, no regulatory oversight. And again, problematic is there's no performance bond that the company has to put up, against which, if they fail to reclaim these roads, that performance bond can be used to affect that, rather than it coming out of our pockets to do that.
That's all good.
We should have whipped it longer.
Did you hear about
Someone's talking.
She wants to do a pull a Trump in
Excuse me, somebody's unmuted. Could you please mute so that we can continue? Thanks so much.
Thanks. So let's go on to mine development. Well, the first thing it has to do is the site has to be prepared. And, here's a picture of what site preparation looks like. So literally skimming the top off the top of the mountain to get ready for mine development. And that is transported into a scene like this. And so there's a scale issue that includes, virtually everything that used to occur on that mountain is now impacted by mine development. That includes things like losing streams, the tributaries, the little tributaries that may be ephemeral, maybe even dry part of the year, are simply mined over. So we've lost part of the drainage network. And it also is about capturing what's left And then there becomes a problem. How do you contain it? And here's an example of a very rudimentary settling pond beside one of the coal mines in southwestern Alberta. And I think you can gauge even from this picture that these things aren't designed large enough to actually capture most of the runoff. And I'll get to why that's a problem. And that leads me to what myself and my colleagues found. Every open pit coal mine in the Eastern Slopes that we investigated over a 50-year period had repetitive operational and structural failures. So these were acute and chronic problems, often catastrophic failures that resulted in all sorts of impacts to water quality, to water quantity, to fish and wildlife population changes, and the inability to deal with that in a way that corrected the problem. And why does this happen? Well, mining coal in the eastern slopes, you're up against some severe topographic constraints. There's a lot of up and there's a lot of down. And if you're not aware of that, and apparently some of these mines didn't seem to be, there are planning failures that resulted in very low design standards despite the topographic constraints that they were under. And then those, even though they may have been aware of it, economics overrode some of the design features that could have provided better environmental protection. Very seldom was monitoring effective to deal with things in a timely fashion when it became evident that something was going to fail. And then lastly, there was very little on the part of government, very little oversight and regulatory enforcement. It almost seemed that once the mine had their permit, there was a hands-off attitude towards it. And my colleagues and I had multiple occasions where we advanced uh, problems that had occurred that should have had enforcement, that should have been, there should have been charges laid either by the provincial or federal provincial officials, and none were. So lots of problems. The fundamental fact, and again, topographic constraints would tell you that once you start taking some of the tops off these mountains, erosion is going to occur. And that means that there's going to be sediment transport up to 1,000 times greater than what was there before. And so that creates the first line of problems in terms of how do you deal with that sediment. Sediment, one of the major issues, particularly sediment that's above background levels, it affects the physical habitat of trout by infilling the pools that they live in, creating the lack of spawning opportunities because the sediment becomes entrained within the substrate and over the substrate. Incubation of trout eggs becomes a problem because oxygen can't flow through some of these areas after the sediment has sealed them. Aquatic insects, of course, live in that same substrate. These are the building blocks of trout flesh, and if they're not doing well, trout won't either. There can be physiological stress. Too much sediment in the water causes stress to fish, and this can cause, if not direct mortality, it can add to the problems that fish have and increase mortality rates. And so all of these mean that survival of trout becomes problematic. The other thing which happened time and time and time again was that there was a failure to recognize that extreme weather events happen. They were never modeled, and so they were never put into the design features for the mines. And so as a consequence, every time there was one of these extreme weather events, whether it was rapid snow melt or rain on snow events or a catastrophic rainstorm, things just came unglued. And the other thing is that once you disturb the surface of these mountain sides, particularly when you run through and mine through some of the streams, what you do is you speed up the rate at which water runs off that landscape. And that's also one of the contributing factors to flooding that happens that led to some of these catastrophic failures. And that meant that tremendous amounts of sediment were washed into receiving streams, many of which had native trout in them. And the settling ponds were grossly underdesigned to capture and trap that sediment, and it often resulted in severe washouts of these settling ponds. Again, then releasing more sediment into the system. And here's an example of uh, a sediment break in a settling pond that simply inundated that stream and its substrate with mud, frankly. Now, these are not things that were not predicted. These are completely predictable events. And as the Mount Polley Independent
Oh,
Investigation panel found, there was a failure of engineering. And they made a very simple statement. It's axiomatic that nothing in engineering or in life can be assured with 100% certainty. And so, even with the best of engineering, there could be problems and have been problems. And again, so if you couple that with putting a mine in a topographically challenging area, bad things will happen and have happened and will continue to happen. Now, since this is really about fish, and I've restricted my comments to fish because I wanted to keep the presentation to a reasonable length, the point that I think all of us need to recognize is that fish aren't a product of the water. They're a product of the landscape. So everything that we do in the landscape and on the landscape flows past or through a fish. And so that means that fish are affected by everything that we do in the landscape. And the more things we do in the landscape, the greater our land use footprint, the greater the impact on fish and fish habitat. So I think it's important then, and I'll make a pitch for this. What do fish tell us? What does their presence, their abundance, their distribution tell us about the watershed? Well, they are the report cards for how well we're doing in the watershed. They're the integrators. They're telling us by indication whether or not we are successful in managing the landscape. And if we're not, they are the sentinels because they're the ones that are affected first and probably most by changes and problems in the watershed. The issues that we face, and it's not just coal mining, it's all of the land use activities that we do in the eastern slopes. We have taken streams and habitats that were cold, clean, complex, and connected. In fact, if you want to chant that as a mantra, you will understand what it takes for fish to make a living in eastern slope streams. We've taken those four components and we've turned them into warmer, dirtier, simpler, and fragmented. And as a consequence, that's why all of the trout species up and down the eastern slopes are imperiled in one way, shape, or form. So, in summary, what do coal mines do to fish? Well, first of all, there's the loss of critical physical habitats, just simply by infilling some of the streams and by affecting the remaining streams in other ways, particularly because of water quality changes and additions of contaminants like selenium. Because mines operate at a watershed scale and they change the way the water is captured, stored, and runs off, there are hydrologic shifts. And so what it means is that the stream flows change from being relatively stable or within a range of natural variation to situations where there's higher amounts of flow in the spring and coupled with lower amounts of flow in the fall and winter. And those have dramatically negative impacts on fish and fish habitat as well. Of course, just the sheer amount of sediment that is created by a coal mine by the immutable laws of gravity finds its way downhill into the streams that trout occupy. And then I mentioned the physiological impacts, the stress that all that creates on fish populations. Just some of the issues that mines create in terms of water quality problems. One is calcite. Think of calcite as proto-cement. Most of our rocks are sedimentary in origin, and so in the grinding process of shattering the top of off mountains and pushing them into stream valleys, calcite is released, and calcite literally cements stream substrates together, making it very difficult for fish like bull trout or cutthroat trout or Athabasca rainbow trout to move the stream substrates around to create the nests in which their eggs are laid. In fact, to be successful, trout would have to develop opposable thumbs so they could grasp a pickaxe to break through this calcite layer. That's how hard it is. When you walk on one of these in a stream, it's like walking on a cement sidewalk. And then there's selenium. Well, selenium, and it's part of a witch's brew, which I'll get into in a minute here, of elements that are released. But selenium is the most troublesome because selenium causes genetic abnormalities to occur in animals that live in the water and near the water. It causes problems in spawning, and of course the physiological shifts that it makes in species means that they have very low survival rates. Selenium below a very small concentration, anything above 1 part per billion is considered to be bad for aquatic life. In the McLeod River drainage, uh, where you might have heard of the Coal Branch, the McLeod River flows into the Athabasca east and north of Edson. 92% of the native Athabasca rainbow trout have disappeared in that watershed, and the only reason for their demise can be explained by selenium exposure. It's ironic we often look to the Elk Valley and the Elk River as an example of what not to do in a watershed with coal mining. We have our own Elk River in Alberta, in the McLeod River, in the Coal Branch. Now, you may have heard some of the rhetoric that don't worry, we have the technology. This is something we hear from the coal industry, and we've been hearing it more and more from our Alberta politicians. Well, I'm here to tell you that there is no successful treatment that will reduce selenium levels in mine-related contamination to levels that will allow aquatic life to persist. You can take that to the bank. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that the coal industry is providing is, don't worry, we've got the technology, we're working on the technology, and if you just allow us the permit to mine, we'll continue to figure this out. The problem is nothing has worked at mine scale. Tech, or what has become Tech in the Elk Valley of BC, have spent almost $1 billion now in trying to come up with a successful remediation technique for selenium for their mines. Nothing has worked. And in fact, selenium now has been allowed to transport downstream for 575 miles all the way into Montana. And that, I think, is exemplary of the fact that the technology will never work at mine scale because the scale of mines are too large to have any technology work, because this is not end of pipe treatment. It's on a broad scale. None of them have worked at mine scale. And more importantly, none of them have worked over long periods of time. There are coal mines in Britain that were opened originally by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago that still spew toxic chemicals into receiving waters. And so for any company to tell us that they're developing the technology or they have the technology that will operate at a mine scale, we also have to ask, how long will you have to treat water before it's no longer a problem for aquatic life and downstream water drinkers? And nobody knows the answers to that. Uh, the Tent Mountain mine, which has now been closed for 40 years, now produces selenium concentrations in Crow's Nest Creek that are 92 times above the threshold that's safe for aquatic life. So you can start to understand that this is a bit of a smokescreen, and don't be put off by it. Ask the hard questions. Now, selenium is not the only thing. Here is a witch's brew of other chemicals and elements that are part of the overburden that's blasted, shattered, and pushed into valley sides. When when it's intact, very little leaching happens. But when it's blasted, the surface area increases. There's more opportunity for air and water to interact with that rock. And that's when the concentrations start to escalate from not only selenium, but a variety of these other elements and chemicals. And the one that's also concerning, the polycyclic aromatic compounds, researchers have found that this becomes airborne, and these PACs, as they are known, have been found on the Alberta side of the border, blown there from coal mines in the Elk Valley. And some of these have been blown as far as almost Calgary. These are cancer-causing elements, and I don't think this is something that we need to introduce into the environment, given all the other issues that we have to deal with. So, the bottom line, the aquatic environment is harmed by coal mining, and trout and coal mines cannot coexist. And as I've told you, trout are the indicators, the report cards of how well we're doing in a watershed. When they disappear, and they have in some watersheds, the native cutthroat trout have disappeared below Tent Mountain. They disappeared some years after mining ceased, but they are gone and they're never coming back. And so, this is one of the references that you might want to review, and it speaks to the legacy, the environmental legacy of coal mines in the Crow's Nest Pass. And that's not unique to just the Crow's Nest Pass. So the next step is, and the rhetoric will be, well, we can mitigate these things. Well, mitigation, is a slick term that may disguise the fact that it doesn't actually work. And so I think that we need to go back to a children's nursery rhyme. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. And I think that's the way you should view mitigation. It's not a way of completely remediating or restoring what was there before. It's like putting a bullet or putting a bandage or a band-aid on a bullet wound, or putting lipstick on a corpse. There are some assumptions that have been made, generally by consultants that have been working for coal companies, about trout mitigation. They will say, well, don't worry, we can build habitat, and it will be equivalent to the critical habitat that's been destroyed or changed. We can build habitats that will increase populations. We can increase stream productivity, or stream productivity isn't the limiting factor. These things that we will build will persist, and that the fish population will be real, not just movement from other habitats. None of these have been proven to be true. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. Um, Built habitats do often do not resemble critical habitats. They don't increase populations. Stream productivity is the primary limiting factor, and it doesn't matter how much physical habitat you build if there isn't enough primary productivity. For example, in the form of aquatic invertebrates, fish will not increase. Built habitats wash out on a regular basis, and fish populations, if there is an increase, it's generally because they move from other areas. Part of the problem is that streams are dynamic. They move back and forth, and they shift, and particularly bed load movement is common. And so that provides a first of an issue with trying to mitigate stream habitat, particularly with built structures. Here's a project I worked on years ago. It was a pipeline crossing. Uh, they had crossed the stream and they had agreed that they would rebuild the stream bank in a way. So on the left is the rebuilt stream bank. It involved boulders cabled together. It looked beautiful. Unfortunately, the stream didn't like it. The stream moved away, and the scene on the right is what it looks like now. So streams shift, and that means that the habitat that's built has to shift with it. And this is a usual mitigation. This is one of the stream mitigation projects for one of the coal mines. There's no floodplain, there's no riparian zone. All the structures are placed equidistant to one another, despite the fact that physics provides the answer that that's not where those pools should be, and inevitably those pools will wash out or infill. The other thing is that it's more than designing a channel. On your left is a ditch. That's essentially what they've designed for mitigation. Whereas trout habitat on the right involves not only riparian vegetation, but you can see that log there. Large woody debris is a fundamental part of stream habitat for trout and is never incorporated in some of these stream mitigation projects that coal companies do. Now, I won't go through this, but the problem is that research has told us that these things do not persist. And oftentimes, initially up to about a 1 in 3 flood interval, they'll stay and it appears that they're doing well, but you get a good flood, 1 in 50, 1 in 100 year flood, and these things wash out, flood, fill in, and are no longer suitable. Now, this leads me to the next thing, which is we need good land use planning. Land use planning is an opportunity to use science, use evidence to tell us what we should do. And in fact, I might say that the document on the right, a policy for resource management, the Eastern Slopes, this was the Eastern Slopes policy that said in the 1970s, the highest and best use, the priority for the Eastern Slopes is watershed protection. We have deviated significantly from that very profound planning aid. Now, we do have sub-regional plans like the Livingston Porcupine Hills sub-regional plan that we were able to get linear disturbance thresholds in, but not spatial thresholds. So we got linear, which is the number or the density of roads and trails, but we did not get the Alberta government, primarily the Alberta Forest Service, resisted any idea of a spatial footprint. In other words, how big the human land use footprint is and what degree should it be at. And so it leads me to this, is that in our land use planning, we often defer, and this is a problem in Alberta, to ideology rather than evidence. And so it's the simple but wrong as opposed to the complex but right. And so there we have one of the fundamental problems in land use planning. is if we're not using the evidence, if we don't use cumulative effects assessment, if we don't use ecological thresholds, then what are we using to plan for the future? And I might add as well, good land use planning is about good engagement and public consultation, which we have not seen much of in the last few years. So I'm going to grab a Kerry Larson cartoon here. The sign on the wall says first pants, then your shoes. So first, we should have land use plans. And then once we have land use plans, once we've gone through the evidence, once we've gone through public consultation, then we can develop policy on sectors. For coal, we've got this exactly backwards. And the flip-flopping on coal is an example of this, this change from instead of doing land use planning first, the answer is coal. What is the question? What we really should do, and this is just my personal view of it, is these are the things that we need to incorporate into land use plans. We need to understand that what goes around comes around. We have to understand that everything is connected, that everything is additive, that diversity equals stability, and we humans are in the loop. If we did that, I think we would have the template for better land use plans. Instead, this is what we have. We got the crooked storekeeper with his finger on the scale and the lady trying to balance it. That's the dichotomy in Alberta between conservation and development. And that dichotomy does not seem to be going away and requires us as citizens to be ever alert and ready to ask, why is this balance so off kilter? So when the five of us provided our recommendation to the Coal Policy Review Committee, this was our summary. It's the Pandora's box of coal development in the Eastern Slopes. And we said our recommendation is don't open it. If it's open, close it and never open it again. For those of you who want to read the report that we provided to the Coal Policy Committee, this is the title, and it's available on the Alberta Wilderness Association website. I warn you, it's a 50-page report. We put a lot of effort into this to provide the detail that the Coal Policy Committee needed to come up with a better set of rules for coal development in Alberta. It was on the Alberta government website for a while. It's since been taken down. So you can draw your own conclusions as to why that is. So lastly, let's just go, what should be a new coal policy for Alberta's Eastern Slopes? Well, first, there needs to be financial accountability for the full cost of reclamation so that we don't end up paying the bill. There needs to be the completion of reclamation at higher standards that also includes dealing with selenium from legacy coal mines. And so that's the amelioration of water quality issues. We need long-term monitoring and reporting. In other words, how well is reclamation working? How well are we dealing with water quality contamination? We need a long-term solution to the settling ponds, which are ticking time bombs, waiting to go off with the next severe storm that happens. We need successful restoration of native trout populations where they've been impacted by coal mining development and exploration. And lastly, and most importantly, based on our evidence, not our feelings, not our opinions, the evidence, it's the recognition that coal mining no longer fits in the Eastern Slopes. Thank you very much, and I'd be pleased to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Lorne, for all this amazing information. We have a few questions here. Whoops, let me just Sorry. Um, Someone wrote, well, Gord would like to know what your top 3 bullets are. Gord has 5 minutes in front of the Okotoks Town Council to persuade them to endorse the new coal policy document from High River Town Council. So do you have 3 top bullets that he can use?
Well, I think the first one is the evidence is that coal mining causes environmental issues that we cannot remediate. I think we need to recognize, second of all, that some of those water quality issues and air quality issues are human health issues. And I don't think we need to be introducing new problems for human health with coal mining. And I think lastly, coal mining is a sunset industry. It's not something that has a viable future. And why on earth we would want to invest in it at this stage in its demise beggars imagination.
Okay, great. Another question. Are there any examples of reclamation areas that were successfully reestablished or successfully reestablished fish populations at all?
No.
No, right. I thought that.
Good, simple answer.
A question from another person said, what will selenium do to humans and livestock?
I'm not a toxicologist, but the limited amount of understanding that I have is that there are limits for selenium consumption for both livestock and for humans. But I think the one thing that you want to keep in mind is that selenium bioaccumulates. And so when Benga, which was the forerunner to Northback, did the EIA for their first run at a mine development at Grassy Mountain, they both did water quality analysis in Gold and Blairmore Creeks, which flow off the flanks of Grassy Mountain, and did fish tissue analysis for selenium. Water quality analysis showed that selenium didn't tip into the danger zone as an impact on aquatic life. But when the fish tissue analysis was done, it was orders of magnitude higher. Selenium was orders of magnitude higher in fish flesh than standards indicate it should be. By the way, Benga hid this in one of the appendices to their report, and it never came out at the JRP hearing. So understanding that selenium bioaccumulates, it goes up the food chain. Who's at the top of the food chain? We are. And so in one way, shape, or form, it will bite us. And so whether it's a clinical problem, whether it's a problem in terms of forage or foodstuffs, where selenium becomes part of them, it may not immediately impact human health, but it may impact the economy. For example, do you want McDonald's saying, do you want selenium with your French fries?
Okay, a question here. Someone heard that all fresh water in Alberta is polluted in some way through the extraction of fossil fuels. What's your perspective on that?
Well, there are water quality problems. I don't know if it's necessarily an issue everywhere. The problem I think we have is we only have about 100 water quality monitoring stations in Alberta. So despite the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas saying that we're the most heavily monitored uh, jurisdiction in the world for water quality, I don't think that holds water, no pun intended. And so the other part is, even though we've got 100 water quality monitoring stations, they're only monitored once a month. And so a lot of things can slip through the cracks. So if there are issues, I don't think we're doing a very good job of understanding what the issue is, what the constituents are that cause issues, what the problems are from an aquatic health standpoint, and what the problems are from a human health standpoint.
Thank you. And Andrea has a question. Are trout considered a keystone species? And if so, what are some of the long-term impacts on their extirpation?
Well, a quick answer is yes, they are a keystone species. As I pointed out before, there are report cards. If something is going wrong with their abundance or distribution or health, I think that tells us something about how we're managing our watersheds. And the fact that every one of them is imperiled in some way should tell us all that we're not managing our watersheds in a way that would get us a high degree of or a high grade for stewardship.
Thank you. A question from Michael. Why is this government so adamant about coal mining? There are 100 reasons why not, but why do they continue?
I'm a biologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a poli-sci major. I wish I knew the answer to that question because all the evidence points to the obvious, which is coal mining is a dumb idea. Unfortunately, I think we're driven by ideology. And I think the ideology is that the fossil fuel industry is good, um, and it's circular logic. If the fossil fuel industry is good, we must have more of it.
Thank you so much. Just for the people attending, there's a lot of good links in the messages. So if you have time to take 2 minutes now and do a snapshot of them, there's people who are referencing some really important information and links to places. I have a question. We talked about this briefly, but how do we, as a society, shift from an anthropocentric approach to an ecocentric approach to save things? We talked about public engagement. You mentioned public engagement as one of the tools. And these speaker series are part of that process. But do you have any other ideas where we can start besides books? I mentioned that Lorne has written a number of books that are just amazing. And public engagement and the rallies, and there's not enough being written about it in the media. How do we do this? The current situation in public schools in Alberta is they have a huge amount of emphasis on ecology, particularly in high school, and careers in ecology. And yet the oil and gas companies are going in and putting propaganda up. So one situation I had when I was doing a workshop in a primary school, elementary school, about ecology and what children could do on a very small basic level to start things growing in the right way. And I had children put up their hands and say, my dad says you've lied. That's not true. So do you have any other suggestions that ordinary people can do to engage the public and get more information out there to be informed?
Have you got a couple hours?
I'd love to, Lorne. Yes, I do, actually. I do have a few hours.
My simple answer to this is that until we develop critical thinking skills, and those critical thinking skills, are not only about ecology and the environment, but politics and what drives politics, and the ability to sift through, a lot of the erroneous misinformation that we see on social media.
Yes.
We will continue down this road of thinking that we are separate from the environment, that we're immune from the effects that happen to the environment. And if nothing else, the recent events that are ascribed to climate change should help us understand that we're on a path that we may not like the end point. And so that's where critical thinking, I think, provides us the ultimate way of helping everyone understand what some basic and maybe fundamental science is, and give them a much better basis upon which to make a decision about simple things like, you know, should I buy an EV? Uh, should I put solar panels on my house? Uh, should I should I buy the latest in fashion wear? What are my consumptive habits? Should I plant a garden? All of those sorts of things, I think, will come out of a much better understanding based on critical thinking of where we're at in the world and where we need to be if we want to survive, and also recognize that this is not just about our survival. Uh, I in a presentation I gave years ago, I asked people, how many of you have children? Um, and a few people put up their hands, and I said, well, how many of you are contemplating having children? And a few more people put up their hands. And then the next question was, well, were you a child in the past thinking that that your parents and adults were looking after your future? Because that's the obligation that we have for our generations to think about subsequent generations and what we may be bequeathing to them as a legacy of our overconsumptive habits and our inability to come to grips with the changes in the world that are human caused.
Thank you so much, Lorne. Just one person asked if you could just restate where the report that you did can be located online, and someone responded the AWA website.
That's right, the AWA
Right? Does
website,
everybody
and
get that?
I think you have to go to their blog, um, and you'll find it there.
Okay, I don't
Anyway,
see any.
happy reading.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions, but there's a lot of really terrific comments on here. So if people want to take a few minutes to take a screenshot, please do so now. In the meantime, I'd just like to close. Lorne, you've been brilliant as always. It's just such a treat to be able to hear this information. And if anybody wants to review it, it will be on the Alberta Resistance website in a couple of days. The first few minutes were cut off, so somebody asked if you could give us the slides from the first 2 minutes of the mine areas before and after. Whoops. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lorne. And thank all of you who came today and are leaving, taking away information that's really valuable and that we can share. I have to just say a comment that something that I've been thinking about for so long. I've met so many people in getting out there and protesting, going to rallies, researching, teaching, becoming involved. And prior to that involvement, I was sitting at home worrying and anxious and just completely morose at the way things were going. And so I would suggest to anybody who tends to feel that way also, the solution is to get out there. There are so many groups working on the environment right now, and we're being heard and we're loud and we're vocal. Join those groups, find out information, and there's a whole community of people out there that are thinking the same way that we do and who care the same way. And it's a great way to feel stronger and that there's hope that we can do some things. Again, I'm here from ABA Resistance, so if you want to get the newsletter, if you want to be involved with our work, standing up and taking advantage of some legally allowed political avenues, please check out abresistance.ca. And if you would like your name to be kept on the mailing list for future speakers, right now every third speaker or second speaker is on the topic of coal mining because it's the most pressing concern to most of us. But we also have speakers on every one of the issues from healthcare to ABA, the Alberta Pension Plan, to education and so on down the line. So once again, thank you, Lorne, so very, very much. It's been wonderful to hear you speak.